Today on this episode of The Brain Surgeon's Take, we will be discussing Extreme is Nothing with professional Ironman triathlete and medical student at The Ohio State University, Matthew Marquardt. Hear about this legendary individual and how he is not only striving to become one of the greatest endurance athletes on the planet, but also aiming to change the face of cancer as a physician and scientist. Much more on this podcast episode. Welcome back, everyone. Here's my take on Dr. Kevin Tracey. He is an expert on the human body's hidden power, not in the muscles or the brain, but in a single remarkable connection between them both, the vagus nerve. Dr. Tracey is a world-renowned neurosurgeon, inventor, and researcher. He is also a pioneer in bioelectronic medicine and president of the Feinstein Institutes for Medical Research. His groundbreaking work has revolutionized how we understand inflammation, immunity, and the body's own electrical circuits. Now he's bringing decades of discovery to the page in his powerful new book, The Great Nerve: Unlocking the Body's Secret Pathway to Healing. In The Great Nerve, Dr. Tracey explores how tapping into the vagus nerve's hidden potential could treat everything from arthritis to depression, not with drugs, but with targeted electrical stimulation. It's science that sounds like science fiction, but it's actually happening now. What an eye-opening interview, even for a fellow brain surgeon, learning how our body might already have the tools to heal itself. Listen up as we discuss The Great Nerve. Check it out. Hey, Kevin, how are you?
Very good. How are you? Thanks for having me on. This is great.
No, of course. Listen, very excited to talk to you. And not only are you a renowned neurosurgeon and scientist, but now also a best-selling author with your new book, The Great Nerve. I'm excited to hear all about it.
Thank you. Well, it'll be fun. It'll be a fun chat. I'm looking forward to going through it with you.
I mean, I guess the first question would be, you're obviously a busy scientist, surgeon. What was your impetus to write the book, The Great Nerve?
The main reason for the book now is to provide a resource, a basic platform for people to talk about what's going to be, I think, a very important topic for millions of patients and physicians, which is understanding that it's possible to implant a computer chip on the vagus nerve in the neck as a therapy for rheumatoid arthritis. The FDA has approved this concept now as a clinical modality, and there'll be a product launch for this idea over the coming weeks and months. And what that means is patients will have a choice of a battery-powered computer chip instead of weekly or monthly injections of biologic drugs with black box warnings and many side effects. It also means it's a new way of thinking about approaching the disease. That new way of thinking means it's a new way of thinking about it for patients. It's also a new way of thinking about it for physicians. So there's lots of questions, right? How does it work? How reproducible is it? What does it mean to have the surgery? And so it was time for the book. And in the book, I try to place in understandable language, I try to place these conversations into an accessible form.
Well, let's go over a little background for our listeners that may not be physicians. What exactly is the vagus nerve and what's its significance to the human body?
It is a nerve that starts in your brainstem at about the level of your ears. You have two of them, like two thumbs. We say the vagus nerve, but you have two. And each of these travel from the brainstem down the neck on both sides, across the chest, and down into the abdomen. And along the way, it sends off branches into all the organs that you never think about all day long: your heart, your lungs, your liver, the other organs in your abdomen. And again, I said there's two vagus nerves. Actually, inside each of those cables of that we call the vagus nerve is actually 100,000 fibers. And so the vagus nerve is actually carrying signals like a transatlantic cable carries signals under the ocean. The vagus nerve, these 200,000 vagus nerves, are carrying the signals that provide the information your brain needs to keep all of your organs functioning in balance, in a harmony, through the reflex messages that travel up and down. 80% of the signals in the vagus nerve are actually sensory, meaning they're traveling from the organs to the brain. And the arrival of that information in the brain activates reflex responses that travel back down the vagus nerve and other nerves to those organs to keep them functioning well. So all day long, your vagus nerve is carrying this information back and forth so that your organs can function without you thinking about them.
How did you first get interested in this specific nerve? Was there a sentinel event during your career?
There was a sentinel event in the laboratory which came about quite unexpectedly. I had spent many years studying inflammation and studying the molecules that produce inflammation in your body, especially one called TNF, which is a cytokine, which there was a lot of information about during the COVID pandemic. And so people talked about cytokine storm. TNF is a cytokine. It's made by white blood cells. And when it's overproduced in an unregulated way or a dysregulated way, it actually causes damage to even to normal tissues. And that's one of the things that happens in conditions like rheumatoid arthritis. So I'd been thinking about this for many, many years. And we were studying a experimental drug we had made in the lab, a molecule we called 1493. And when we put 1493 into the brains of animals with a stroke to stop the TNF and stop the inflammation, as we expected, the stroke was smaller because the inflammation in the brain was less. What we didn't expect is that the presence of 1493 in the brain somehow reduced the amount of TNF in the organs in the body. And this there was no plausible explanation for this. This came out of left field. After many months and then subsequently years of work, what we had discovered unexpectedly was that 1493 had turned on signals in the vagus nerve. And those signals in the vagus nerve were the reason that inflammation in the body was stopped. Once we knew that, it became a thought experiment. Well, if the vagus nerve is turning off inflammation and it's doing that by transmitting signals, can we build a computer chip, a nerve stimulating device to mimic those signals? And now the vagus nerve, treat it like the brakes in your car to slow inflammation. Instead of slowing your car going down a hill, now we use computer chips to activate the brake line in the vagus nerve, which stops inflammation.
Now, so it does regulate inflammation, but what about the immune response? That's another incredibly interesting aspect of the vagus nerve. How and in what form does it modulate the immune response?
That's an active area of research now. That's a very important question being studied by dozens of laboratories around the world. What we know a lot about is how one aspect of the immune response, the inflammatory response to injury or infection. We know that cholinergic neurons originating in the brainstem, those are neurons that use acetylcholine as the neurotransmitter, travel down into the abdomen where they terminate on a ganglia, a collection of nerve cell bodies outside the spleen, to activate a second set of neurons that use norepinephrine as the neurotransmitter that projects into the spleen. And inside the spleen, the norepinephrine from those neurons activates a T cell subset that we discovered, and it also makes those T cells make acetylcholine, so we call them T-chat. The T-chat produced acetylcholine is what turns off the monocytes and macrophages in the spleen from making TNF, IL-1, and other cytokines. So that's what we know. And we know that in mice and rats and dogs and pigs, and the human evidence that we have, the clinical evidence that we have so far supports all of that. Of course, we can't go into the human spleens and look at all the cells like we can in animals, but the scientific understanding of what we call the inflammatory reflex is quite solid. What is being explored by many other laboratories are applying that same basic approach to the question. If you're interested in, say, B cells making antibodies, can you find neural signals under the control of the vagus nerve or other nerves to the spleen that modulate how B cells make antibodies? And there's some early work that's very suggestive from one of my colleagues here at the Feinstein Institute in New York, Betty Diamond, And Betty has been studying that question, and she's actually showed that the signals from the vagus nerve to the splenic nerve do influence how B cells in the spleen organize themselves and make antibodies. So that it's early days onto what the impact of neural signals are going to be on understanding responses to vaccines and response to adaptive immune responses. But we have a very advanced understanding now of how vagus nerve signals control the innate immune response, which controls inflammation.
One of the more interesting terms of your book was bioelectronic medicine. I thought that was great. Maybe just go over what that means for our audience.
It's a new term, well, new for many. In the book, we've been working on this for 10 or 15 years now. It brings together three really important ideas, and to understand it best, let's first start with how do you make a drug? How does the pharmaceutical industry make a drug? So the first step is you pick a condition, an illness that you want to solve. The second is you pick a molecular target, and then you screen for molecules to hit the target, assess the toxicity of those molecules, and pick the best ones and sell them. That's the pharmaceutical industry model for 125 years. The tools have changed, but the model hasn't. In bioelectronic medicine, we ask a different question. We say, okay, pick a condition and pick the target. Fine, that overlaps with the pharma approach. But now, rather than screen for molecules, let's ask the question, are there nerves, which touch nearly every cell in your body, which produce molecules, neurotransmitters, which can control the target? If you can identify those nerve signals, now you can go to the third phase, which is build a device with biomedical engineering and Silicon Valley technology to control the nerve, to produce the signal, to control the target. And bringing those things together gives a approach to making new therapies that's grounded in scientific mechanisms, molecular mechanisms, neurophysiologic mechanisms, and engineering mechanisms, where you can now sort of tailor make a device to treat the disease. The advantage of the device approach is several. One is the device can be turned off. If it doesn't work or if it has a side effect, not likely, but it might have a side effect, you can turn it off or take it out. Second, even when it's working, you can control the duration and half-life because nerve signals have short durations. So knowing that, you can tailor your therapy to the biologic response you want and go give therapy to the nerve based on the duration of the biologic response rather than the duration of how long the drug lasts in the body. And third, and maybe most important to some, is that when you take a drug, whether it's injected or swallowed, it gets into your bloodstream and your tissues, and it can go to many, many places, if not everywhere in your body. Whereas nerve signals act locally, and you can target your therapy to an organ, the spleen in the case of the inflammatory reflex, or other tissues in the case of other devices that are being developed.
Yeah, I mean, I think the benefit of a directed nerve stimulation as opposed to systemic drug administration is very, very clear. And that's the most promising avenue. You mentioned rheumatoid arthritis. What other conditions is the vagus nerve being targeted as a potential therapeutic avenue?
The other conditions include other autoimmune diseases such as inflammatory bowel disease, multiple sclerosis, diabetes, even neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. But before we get to that, which hasn't been subjected to rigorous clinical trials yet, those are laboratory results. What we do know about rheumatoid arthritis that has led to the FDA approving this therapy for patients with rheumatoid arthritis in the United States, that's based on a series of clinical trials. The first one dating back to the mid 20-teens. That trial was done in Europe, and it was performed in Bosnia and Croatia and the Netherlands. Patients with severe rheumatoid arthritis, meaning that they have pain, swelling, and damage in their joints that is not responding to medications like steroids and biologics. The biologics, things like anti-TNF and anti-IL-1 that you see advertised almost every night on the news and almost every weekend on the football games. and other sports events. These patients were essentially, if you talk to them, they tell you they felt like they were out of options because they still have progressive, painful disease limiting their life despite all these drugs. These patients received a implant in their left neck, and many of them gained significant clinical benefit. Their pain and swelling in their hands and other joints improved. There are stories out there in the public domain, in the media, and on social media of patients who are able to now ride their bicycle, go up and down stairs, even go to the gym and work out on a treadmill. These same individuals were previously unable to button their blouse and unable to pick up a pencil. So there are stories out there of dramatic improvements from that first trial. So in the replication of these results, it was critical to do that in the United States in a larger trial, which was completed last. The results. It was completed last year. The results were announced last November at the American College of Rheumatology. That study was done by a company that I co-founded in 2007 called Set Point Medical. The patients were 242 rheumatoid arthritis patients, again, taking powerful medications and still having progressive symptoms. The study was done in some 42 centers around the United States. And this time, the device that was implanted was very small, the size of a multivitamin, into the left neck. Once it's implanted under the sternocleidomastoid muscle in the carotid sheath in the left neck, you can't even see it. And if the incision is done carefully, you don't see that either because it's in the skin creases on the neck. Again, the study hit its primary endpoint, which means a significant percentage of the patients either were able to stop taking medications or take less medications. And this has led to the FDA approving this device. And the first commercial launch of that should be occurring literally in the next few weeks. I have to be clear, it doesn't work in everybody. There's a lot to learn. We know that it works, and we understand the basic science behind it. In the long run, we're gonna have to see, does it help a third of the patients or half the patients with highly significant outcome? Does it help another third of the patients, give or take, or a quarter of the patients with some benefit, but maybe they still have to take lesser doses of medication or something? And of course, there's always going to be some patients who don't respond to the therapy. Those kinds of questions are going to have to be answered as we continue going forward with more clinical trials, but it'll be easier to do that now that it's FDA approved.
I mean, anytime you're a pioneer and it doesn't really matter what field, there's always going to be resistance from the status quo. What were the biggest scientific or institutional barriers you faced when you were advancing this field?
The scientific barriers were surprisingly few. I was surprised about that. I really was. We published a series of papers in Nature and Science and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences over the years. And we went sort of incrementally and step by step through the basic science mechanisms. And along the way, I think that approach allowed it fairly significant early adoption in the scientific world. You know, the physiologists, the immunologists, the neuroscientists. So that was surprisingly great. What was really difficult for me as a person who's impatient to try to see this idea being used was, well, I started the company in 2007, and it's now FDA approved in 2025. So do the math, 18 years. I mean, first of all, you don't do any of these things alone. You have to realize that you work with dozens and then hundreds of people on the science side, and then you work with dozens and ultimately hundreds of people on the financial side, the business side, and the in the company itself, the actual development and clinical trialing of the device. What I learned along the way is that there's no bad players in this game. You know, the FDA wants to see new things approved by that are safe and effective to help patients. The patients want something. The payers, the insurance company and CMS, they want to pay for things that work well, and they want to pay fairly. And the investors want to make a return on their investment, and the employees in the company want their product to be developed and sold. So there's no problem with the individuals involved. You know, you can read a lot about innovation and you can read a lot about medical But what I learned is there's no alignment of incentives at any step along the way. That's the problem. And nobody told me that when I started, Ricardo. If they had, maybe I wouldn't have done it. But at no step along the way are any of those stakeholders aligned in their incentives. It's remarkable, actually.
Yeah.
So to navigate, what I learned is that to navigate the path successfully, people are quick to say, oh, the technology has to work. I know of a lot of technologies that work that didn't make it, and so do you. Then they say, oh, well, it's all about the inventor. I know a lot of inventors who were never wrong in their life and it didn't go through. And that, well, it's all about the investors. I know a lot of investors so it's not about any one thing. It's about everybody along the way, figuring out how to maximally align one or two of the incentives. If at every step, even you could get two groups of people or two incentive stakeholders to align, then you can go forward. And so I guess what I learned is that, what I learned in college at Boston College at BC in philosophy and history and sociology and English, and that's what gets you through these things.
It's incredible how many roadblocks there are. And like you said, everyone's working towards the same goal, but for very different reasons.
Yeah.
And so you've got to make sure that all of those reasons and incentives get met if you want to have a final product. And that's the institutional and the scientific background. What about your colleagues? Was there any skepticism when you first started?
Well, I mean, what kind of colleagues?
I mean, look, I know how the medical industry works, and there's a lot of egos, there's a lot of divas. Was there any resistance or downplaying of what you were finding and what you were promoting and what you were showing to be valid? Were colleagues? Was there any pushback?
Once again, in the scientific domain, there's been a lot of conversation and challenging questions to push the science forward, and that's how science is supposed to work. You're supposed to put your data out there and your ideas about your data, and then you're supposed to answer everybody's questions, and usually those questions lead to new experiments and new data, and that's how the field moves forward. That's all good. I think that the clinical development of this was driven by the folks at SetPoint and by the investors at SetPoint, and most of the world left them alone, which is another strategy that competitors use sometime. They just say, well, these guys are pioneering a new thing. We'll just watch them, and if they survive and they're out there, then maybe we'll collaborate someday or buy them or help them. But for now, so when you do a startup company like this in a totally new space, you're pretty much on your own, and that's the hard part about it. That's why not everybody wants to do it. It can be lonely out there. And kudos to the folks at SetPoint and their leadership who persevered and did all this. I mean, you couldn't work with a better group of people than the CEO Murthy and the Chief Medical Officer Dave Chernoff. The real answer to your question starts now, when a new idea that as we talked about briefly before on this chat, a new idea means people have to behave differently. You have to have different workflows. Rheumatologists don't call neurosurgeons to help them treat their patients with rheumatoid arthritis. That's going to be a whole new set of referral patterns. Payers are not paying for devices to treat rheumatoid arthritis. They're paying $100,000 a year for biologics, but they're not paying for devices. That requires new kinds of approvals and codes and pre-approvals. Patients with rheumatoid arthritis are used to taking pills. Many of them have injections now, which are invasive, but nobody's ever talked to them before about having a chip implanted in their neck. Now, what I'm quick to point out, and as you know from the book, and thank you for reading it and talking about it, at a minimum, 250,000 patients have already been implanted with vagus nerve stimulators for 40 years. I estimate it's more than 1 million or 2 million worldwide have been treated with this for depression, epilepsy, and most recently to enhance rehabilitation therapy from stroke affecting the hand and arm. So these are all FDA approved indications. Many of these go back for many decades. We know how to do it. We know that it's, as neurosurgeons, that it's safe. We know that the complication rate should be 1% or less, give or take, and that's significantly less than the complication rate of biologics. So this idea that it's a surgery, when discussed in the context of, well, what is your medical condition now? Well, I'm miserable. I can't button my blouse. I might lose my job. I'm spending $100,000 a year for drugs that have black box warnings, which means some of these side effects are potentially fatal. So if you're the patient, it's not all about surgery or no surgery, which is how some physicians, I think, may approach the question. If you're the patient, it's like, I can have essentially an outpatient surgery, a same-day surgery, with a 1.5-inch incision to put in something the size of a multivitamin that can be removed if I don't like it, but might actually have a major therapeutic effect on my life with less side effects. That's the analysis, and it can't be reduced to, well, it's a surgery versus continuing to inject myself or take pills. So the resistance, I think, it's those kind of things that slow the adoption of truly new ideas into clinical practice, which, as you know, can sometimes take 20 years, despite the evidence being overwhelming that it's effective and safe. And that starts now. So up till now, it's been easy, right?
I would say, just listening to your story, I think a very similar scenario was laser ablation for recurrent deep brain tumors, which is something that we do a lot here down in Miami. When that first started, there was big pushback. Oh my God, it's a surgery, even though complication rate's about 1%, they go home the same day. People would rather give Avastin, that's ridiculously expensive and has many complications, or repeat radiation that has a radiation necrosis rate of 15-20% in these recurrent tumors. And there was this big push of, oh, it's surgery. And I think, just like you're saying, these are minimally invasive same day surgeries with an exceedingly low complication rate versus medications that, yeah, you're not dying immediately from the medication or having a complication, but it's in your body, it's expensive, and it can have horrific side effects. So I think I definitely echo what you're saying. When you have a new technology, and the adoption definitely hits some barriers. It's also an incredible collaboration, I have to say, that you've done with biomedical engineering and the tech industry, because as the neurosurgeon, you understand the anatomy and the physiology, but producing the product requires such high level collaboration with these other experts. How close are we to widespread adoption? I mean, you talk about getting FDA approved, 18 years. What are we looking at until you think this is mainstream?
I hope it's not 18 years. I hope it's mainstream very quickly. The answer will come from patient activism. As you know, again, from your own practice and from your knowledge in this space, when you look at a truly novel therapy or a truly novel idea entering medical practice, it's not the physician groups that drive the early adoption. It is patient activism. It's the HIV patients marching on Tony Fauci's office, decades ago when I was an intern. It's the Mary Tyler Moore advocating for diabetes. It's the NFL football players wearing pink ribbons advocating for cancer therapy. That it's it's not a criticism of doctors. I'm a doctor, you're a doctor. That's not what I'm doing here. The reality is, I don't want my doctor, and you don't want your doctor chasing every shiny new object. You want your doctor to be careful and conservative and thoughtful, and that takes time. What patient activism does is it forces attention to speed up the process a little bit. It doesn't short circuit the care and caution. I think we're going to see. Well, let me tell you a story. In the Set Point clinical trial, which needed some 242 patients, I think that's the right number. You can check it. You can check it on clinicaltrials.gov. But 242 patients. They recruited patients and had a online form to fill out. Something like 25 or 30,000 patients filled out the form, and they weren't. No one was expecting that. The same kind of thing happened with the first clinical trial in Amsterdam, when the Sunday newspaper announced the early success of this clinical trial idea. This was back again in the mid-20 teens. There were so many phone calls from rheumatoid arthritis patients that it shut down the hospital switchboard. So there's a pent-up demand by the rheumatoid arthritis patients. Now, I talk to rheumatologists, and you can do the same after this call and go down the hall and ask the rheumatologists how their patients are doing. And they say, oh, most of my patients, they do great. I have my methotrexate and steroids, and some of them are on biologics. That's not what the patients are saying. The patients hate taking those drugs. Many patients can't afford the biologics. Putting the side effect issue aside, they're very, very expensive. They only work in about half the patients. No one knows why. And so patients want the option. So now the question becomes, if the FDA has approved it, patients want the options, doctors are going to have to get up to speed quickly. And again, you asked, the first question you asked me today was, why did I write the book? This is why I wrote the book.
Yeah, I mean, it's to raise awareness. At the end of
Yes.
the day, when I heard this concept, just like any other physician, your initial reaction is skepticism. Then I read the book and it made complete sense. And so, taking the concept even one step further, just like Neuralink is implanting chips in the brain, the vagus nerve controls so many different aspects of the body, including potentially mental health. Do you see a future where these chips are implanted and people can modulate their vagus nerve at home?
I do. I do think that's going to come someday. You and I can talk about future science and flying cars like the Jetsons. You know, that may that's not what we're talking about here, right? You can
Mhm.
also count the lily pads on a pond, and you can calculate the surface area of the pond, and you can look up the doubling time of the pond lily, and you can make an accurate prediction of the future when the pond will be covered in pond lilies. That's not crystal ball future science. That's data driven based on where we are today. Based on where we are today, I look around, I see people implanting magnets under their skin because they want to know which way north is. I look around and I see people implanting RFID chips under their skin at home, so that they don't have to swipe the lock on their office door or their car or their garage. And you know, that idea of implanting chips that are small and safe is a much lower barrier than than most of our colleagues, physician colleagues, would think at first blush. The barrier is quite low. And so if that's a reality, and the other reality is that as we speak, we're mapping the path, the route, and the function of all 200,000 fibers of the human vagus nerve. That's happening upstairs in my colleague Stavros Zanos's lab under a big NIH grant, to be the first, by the way, definitive map of the human vagus nerve, which is kind of mind-boggling that we haven't done that before.
Mhm.
Um, those kinds of maps combined with what we can do in the laboratory in mice, and we have done using optogenetics and other technologies to stimulate individual nerve fibers, you can actually figure out the individual function of individual fibers. As the chips get smaller and more precise, I think it's within our reach that we will have chips we can implant on various parts of the vagus nerve to control various fibers that do highly specific things. And could those be controlled by an iPhone in your pocket? Of course, no
It's
problem.
amazing. It's absolutely amazing. And I think, where do you, or what take home message would you want any reader of your book, whether they're a scientist, a physician, a layperson, the most important message of your book for your readers?
Curing some diseases that were previously incurable is on the horizon. And this will come about by understanding that every cell in your body is within shouting distance of a neuron, which means that everything that's happening in your body is also happening in your nervous system, and everything happening in your nervous system is influencing everything that's happening in your body. As we dive into that and understand it better and better, we will be able to cure diseases tomorrow that are incurable today. And I say this knowing that there was a time not that long ago, in the time of my great grandparents and grandparents, when some diseases that don't even essentially exist today were deemed incurable, and they were infectious diseases. And as we've reduced the lethality and the toll of infectious disease in the last 100 years, we've expanded health span and lifespan by some 20 years. The next challenge will be reducing the burden of conditions caused by inflammation, which are the leading killers of the human race today. Every year, 40 million people die on the planet Earth. 60 million people die on the planet Earth. 40 million, 2/3, die of diseases of inflammation, which include cardiac disease, heart attack and stroke, heart failure, infection of the lungs, sepsis, um, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, neurodegeneration, diabetes, and obesity, metabolic syndrome. These conditions are, and even cancer, these conditions are either caused by inflammation or made worse by inflammation. So the question that keeps me up at night now is, if we someday could cure inflammation, which we can't do today, like we cured many infections, what would happen to the lifespan and the health span of the human race? I think it would have to get longer, 10 or 20 years. I don't know. And I think those kinds of questions are going to be answered in the coming years, and not in the coming 100 years, but in the coming 10 or 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think you really hit the nail on the head when you talk about inflammation. If you look at any anti-aging, longevity research, I mean, inflammation is really at the basis for the vast majority of chronic diseases and mortality. And a lot of research and emphasis is going on how do we reduce inflammation, the foods we eat, the activities we do, the exercises we do, how we sleep. All that stuff centers around inflammation. And I think that's really the basis of your work. Wrapping up here, because I know you're super busy, I just wanted to summarize for our listeners. First of all, phenomenal interview. Really, two take-home points that I've gotten from this. Number one, the incredible scientific breakthroughs where we went from knowing very little to knowing so much about the vagus nerve and how it applies to future patients. And the second part of the interview is your determination, and I think that came through very clearly during the interview, that you had an idea, and to take an idea from the lab all the way to an FDA approved device concept requires so much determination, grit, and resilience. And you're an example of that, having gone through many different barriers and never been deterred. And now you're getting finally to where you want to be. So kudos for that.
Thank you. Any kudos to me have to be shared with, as I said earlier, the people in the lab who did all the work, the people in the company who did all the work, the investors who invested in the idea. They took big risks too. And ultimately, you know who the real heroes are? It's the patients who not only, we all chose to do what we do, right? We chose to be the physicians and the scientists and the investors and the company employees. We chose to do that. And most of us like what we do. Patients didn't choose to be afflicted with a condition that disrupted their lives, and then on top of that, they volunteer for a trial for which we have no idea if it's going to work or not. So kudos to the patients too. But yeah, this is it's a bright and shiny future now for many patients, and that's what it's all about.
What a terrific body of work during the course of your career, Kevin. Congratulations again on everything. Thank you so much for your time. Terrific interview. Everyone should buy the book, The Great Nerve by Dr. Kevin Tracey.
Thank you so much for having me on.
All right, buddy. Have a great day.
You too.